Amor Fadi, welcome everyone back to Channel KOK. Today we have a returning guest, Mario of Symbolic Studies. And in the past, we've talked about uh, Lovecraft and color symbolism in his two previous appearances on the channel. And now we're going to be talking more about his actual work that he does with his project Symbolic Studies. I'm going to be talking about cross and polar symbolism, which out of all the uh, symbolists and people I've talked to or read about and their work, probably I think one of the most fascinating things to hear about is Mario talking about polar symbolism, and it blows me away. And so I am excited to have him here to talk about his work. And of course, my co host, as always, is the Brants. So welcome, Mario and the Brants, to your channel, KOK.
Well, thanks for the invite, man. I'm excited to have this conversation, and I really appreciate and respect both of you guys. And of course, there's a lot to get into with this topic. So, wherever you want to go, I'm prepared and ready to follow your lead.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the first thing I thought was interesting that I kind of wanted to segue here when we're talking about, I have the physical copy here, the Rene Guenon's Symbolism of the Cross, and that you've recommended because you're a huge fan and you talk about Renee's work all the time. And I got into it. So the crux of this conversation will be referring back to that, of course, for anyone listening who wants to know a good resource of the stuff we're talking about. That one is a good resource.
Mm-hmm.
Um, at the beginning of the book, I found it interesting. Renee talks about uh, the fact that he has to lay out this idea that just because we're talking about something at a symbolic level doesn't mean it's not also historical. There's this idea of multiple layers to something, right? That just because something is mythological or symbolic doesn't mean that there isn't a physicality to it. And that makes me think of another book that's on my reading list I haven't checked out yet, or shared in the comments later on in this video. It's a book about exoteric literature, and its whole crux of its idea, from my understanding, even though I haven't read it yet, is this idea that in the past people understood that there was esoteric things in everything, in writing, in art, in nature. There's these multiple layers. People thought that way in their day-to-day lives, that they understood that it was just a given fact that there was these multiple layers to everything. Not everything was just this mono one idea way of thinking. And at some point in our history, that got changed to where now everyone's fighting over the, oh, well, this thing means this thing, so it can't mean anything else. Now they're just people arguing and about what the meaning of everything is. Right? There's no full on kind of conversations because we're at odds with each other. Um, and so I found it interesting that Rene Guenon talks about it. There's this other book that talks about it. What it made me think of, Mario, and the reason why I wanted to bring it up here at the beginning, not only to let people know that just because we're talking about cross symbolism doesn't mean that we're trying to debunk other ways of thinking or anything.
Mm-hmm.
We're just talking about other perspectives and everything, talking about these multiple layers. The other reason is I know, Mario, in your work, you talk about this polar to solar switch, uh, not just like as from a cosmological standpoint, but from the way I understood it from you talked about it in the past is it's also happened in the minds of man.
Mm-hmm.
It went from everyone viewing the world from a polar symbolic standpoint to a solar, or from a geo to a more of a geocentric to a solar centric kind of way of thinking,
Mhm.
that affected the way people thought and talked and everything. Um, and so I think all of this is connected. That switch from thinking things are esoteric to only meaning a mono exoteric kind of perspective to a polar to a solar switch. That's all kind of fits together. And even the fact that we have to start a conversation with, talking about stuff like that kind of says a lot. So I
Yeah.
wanted to start off with asking you a little bit more, if you would like to get into this idea of a polar to solar flip.
Yeah, for sure. And that's actually that specific topic is what led me to Rene Guenon as well. And so I would say probably starting around 10 years ago, I became interested in the North Star for a few different reasons. And the more I dug into it, the more I realized, and at the time I was really looking into a lot of like occult literature and just like looking into the world of like magic and things like that. And I found that there was a lot of information in that world that had to do with the northern sky, the North Star, Ursa Major and Minor, things like that. But it was kind of underneath the surface of what I was kind of looking into. And so I had to dig a little bit to find some of these resources. And I'm like, wow. So basically, there's an esoteric sort of connection with these stars and with this portion of the night sky and stuff. And that to me was really fascinating. And so the more I dug into that, the more I realized that this is actually kind of part of a whole sort of tradition. And, through a series of kind of encounters with people I had online, and actually by just paying more attention to some of the resources I already had, I realized that Rene Guenon was one of the sort of like premier, I guess, sort of experts, with this symbolic switch from polar to solar. And so I started looking into his work, and sure enough, he writes about it more clearly than like anyone else, in my opinion. So he's pretty much been what I've like consumed myself with over like the last like year and a half. I'm on my ninth Rene Guenon book. I just counted the other day, and I'm like, how many of these books have I read of his? Because that's never happened to me with any other author. Honestly, there's some authors I'll read maybe a couple of books by them or something like that, but his symbolic awareness of things is like really next level in my opinion. And he writes about this big switch, right, from polar to solar. And essentially what he says is that, and he gets into it in so many different ways, but the idea was that during the last golden age, which some people refer to as a primordial tradition, his idea and a lot of people that he basically influenced, and there's people who preceded him that had the same idea, but the idea was that there was a tradition that preceded all other traditions. He refers to it as the primordial tradition. There's a correspondence with the last golden age as well. And what people were sort of concerned with more than anything was this kind of concept related to the center, the monad, supreme unity, right? Non duality as well. And the way I kind of summarize it is that everything emanates or is expressed from a center and then also returns back to the same center. So to acknowledge the center in all things, in the heavens, on earth, within self, in your region, your village, whatever, like that was like sort of like the primary sort of thing people were concerned with. And so if you get in touch with your center, that keeps you grounded. And then the center is also symbolically like a point of orientation as well, right? So like the North Star is the point of orientation. So if you're sailing around the seven seas and you don't have a compass, but you know where the North Star is, you know generally basically where you're headed, right? And so this idea of orientation around a central point is really fascinating. And kind of like the main thing symbolically behind all of this is this idea of a world axis, right? Which is sometimes called the axis mundi. And that there is a symbolic point of pivot that basically everything revolves around, right? And so including Earth and the heavens and things like that. The idea would be, the way I put it at least, is that there are realms above and below, and they all connect through their center. So there's a symbolic bridge or axis or symbolic tree or a pillar or something along these lines. You know, whatever metaphor you want to use that connects all of these different realms. And really, it's kind of no different than like our chakra system, right? So it's like we have a series of chakras. Most people say 7. You have 7 chakra. Chakra means disc or wheel. All your chakras are actually connected through the center, which would be your spine. So your spine would be the symbolic axis, right? So this idea of a world axis, this point of pivot, relates to what some other people have called like the mystic pole tradition, and that this idea of the axis is like embedded in so many different things. Again, the tree, the pillar, the staff or the wand, the phallus, right? And I would say even, you know, the cross, basically, that there's a transcendental center in the cross, which would be where the vertical and horizontal lines meet in a cross if you're just drawing it like on a 2D plane, right? And
Yeah.
there's the X axis and the Y axis, and then there's the Z axis. The Z axis would be the center. This would be the transcendental sort of axis, the vertical axis. And so to me, that's kind of what the cross represents, right? Is like it's this acknowledgement of so many different things, but this acknowledgement of space, forward, backward, left, right, we all kind of emanate across from us. But then also there's this vertical axis as well, this transcendental axis. And so the world axis is like baked into so many different symbols. It's absolutely nuts. So that's kind of what gravitated me towards all of this. But this axis or this center is polar, right? We're talking about a pole. We're talking about the pole star, which has a relationship with the North Pole. So there's that central pole or central axis that everything revolves around. And so I like to say personally that I think we actually live in a polar system, not a solar system. But there is a switch as man sort of fell from grace, as man kind of symbolically migrated away from paradise or Eden, from this sacred center. People's awareness started changing and people's perspective on things started changing. And what I see is that the pole star and the 7 stars in the northern sky, those were the original 7 stars of enlightenment. That was the original sky clock. Primordial people, from what I've gathered, were way more concerned about the fixed stars than anything else. And this could be for a few different reasons. But at some point, man started following the sun more and acknowledging the sun more. And so then people's awareness shifted to the path of the sun, the ecliptic. And so that's like the modern day sky clock. But just like as you were saying, with that shift came a shift in all sorts of other things as well. So it really seems as though there was a major, major symbolic shift from polar symbolism to solar symbolism, even so much so that there are deities that were once considered polar that are now considered solar. And I would actually say Christ, the mythology of Jesus Christ is actually one of them. And that the blueprint for the king of the world, the lord of the world, is actually polar. It's a polar king. They reign from like a central location, which for all intents and purposes, we can say that that's like the North Pole, basically, right? Where some people think where the Garden of Eden was, where paradise was, or what have you. It's interesting too, if you look at old maps like the Mercator map, there's 4 rivers that emanate right from this central location, making essentially a cross. And so a lot of kings and lords over the ages have associated themselves with the cross because they believe they should rule from a central domain. And if they ruled from this central domain, they actually would be considered unifying the above and the below, unifying heaven and earth, right? And so Guenon really gets into that in his King of the World book. And then he has another book called The Great Triad, where he talks about this triune relationship between heaven, earth, and man, basically. So the idea of kings being related to crosses is super, super ancient. You actually see this embedded in the Emperor card as well, which is the 4th card of the major arcana.
Yeah.
And so there's all sorts of different threads we can kind of pull out from here, but that's kind of like the gist of it, I would say.
Yeah. Here's that image of the Emperor card.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, since you have it pulled up, I'd like to point out just the fact that this is the 4th card of the major arcana. So we're talking about the number 4. It makes a lot of sense to speak about the cross as it relates to the number 4 quadrants, 4 arms that emanate from a center. And so if you actually notice in this version of the card, this is the Rider-Waite version. he actually is kind of sandwiched by two mountains, right? They're kind of bookending the scene. There's a mountain on the left and a mountain on the right. And if you look at what he looks like, he actually looks like a mountain himself, because symbolically, I think what they're conveying is that he is the polar mountain in a way. He's like the central mountain, pretty much. And this card relates to Aries, right? And so we're going to be heading into Aries season at the time of this recording here pretty soon. And, you know, what does the ram do? The ram just climbs, right? The ram and the goat, they're excellent climbers. So there is this like ascension sort of dynamic with that. And then also, in my opinion, it's like the pyramid is essentially modeled after a mountain symbolism. It's a symbolic mountain, right? And in pyramid, you literally have ram right there, peer ram id, right? And so, there's a lot going on with this card and the idea of a lord or a king. Christ, right? The crucifixion and resurrection has a correspondence with Aries season as well. We're dealing with lamb symbolism as well, right? The Lamb of God. And so there's a lot of sacrificial symbolism associated with Aries and things like that. But the fact that it's number 4 to me is super fascinating for the reasons that I kind of outlined. And then also there's a huge Jupiter correspondence with this card as well. And Jupiter is the king of the planets, right? And so the glyph for Jupiter even looks like a number 4. And so there's always been, to me, this sort of correspondence seemingly with lords, kings, emperors, and the like, you know, with this cross sort of dynamic in number 4. And you wouldn't necessarily know just by looking at it, but it's definitely there. You know, it's really deeply encoded. But there's a lot to pull out with it.
Yeah. Really quick, since you're talking about returning to center and everything, one thing that I've talked about previously on this channel, and I think I might have brought it up to you briefly, Mario, but I wanted to reseed it here really quickly. Years ago, on a doing a different project, I was looking at the hero's journey, and I got this idea. I go, well, you know, because you can lay out the heroes of the tarot, the cards of the tarot, to lay out the hero's journey, to go all the way around the hero's journey. I go, what other things can you lay over the hero's journey? And so I just started layering things on the hero's journey. One of the things that I did, and I have this rudimentary thing that I did. I changed the opacity of these images here and of the hero journey, and it came out with something really interesting. So here we see the hero's journey, and then I overlaid the pentagram, and you see that each element has 3 parts of the hero's journey in it, except for the 5th element, spirit, aether, is right there at the center. So it's both the known and the unknown. And so when you talk about returning to center and everything, that kind of what, to me, that's what this means when you're going through the hero's journey, because the hero's journey is not just something that you can use for writing. It's a kind of a life mission, right? Each of our life quests as we go on through our lives follows the hero's journey. So we start from spirit, and then we turn back to spirit. We start out of the center, and then we go back to the center. And then we go through this alchemical process of water, fire, earth, and air, and all that. So I just wanted to bring that up really quick, because I think it kind of showcases what you're kind of talking about when it comes to this returning to center idea in a slightly different lighting here.
Yeah. No, totally.
Bring that up really quick.
No, I absolutely see it. And then I just want to point out too, it's like, even when you look at a compass, right, north is up. And I made a video a couple of months ago corresponding midnight with north as well, which is a Guenon thing. And once he turned me on to that, I'm like, holy smokes, that actually makes a lot of sense. So the number 12 on the clock corresponding with the north, right? And there's a lot of midnight symbolism that corresponds with the north. And then just in the simple diagram that you showed, right, the spirit point is pointed upward. Yeah,
Yeah.
so symbolically even pointed towards the north, which would be, you know, symbolically the center as well, like following your true north or your guiding star as an example.
Yeah. Think of things like midnight mass and all
Yeah,
those
yeah,
things.
totally,
Yeah.
exactly.
Branch, is there a question you have with this topic right now?
Yeah, yeah, certainly. I appreciated the mention of the four rivers of Eden. I thought that was really important because, and oh, hey, thanks. and I do agree. I think there is this, central mountain emphasis, Mount Meru, uh, or in the Egyptian, where the first mound of earth comes up out of the sea, and then that's the sacrifice altar. Um, but something that really stood out to me when I was doing some prep for the show, I kind of ran across something happenstance, and the Israeli army back in the day when they were in the Hebrew tribes, or what would soon become the Israel tribes after that, they arranged themselves in a cross formation when they would set up their camp. And in the center of that would be located the Levite priests.
Oh.
So where you would have the monad or the mountain or the emperor or any of these types of symbolisms, that's where the authority was kind of centrally located there. And it was thought that that was essentially what kept the entire population protected, was those priests in the middle communing with what they considered the Holy Spirit, or what was known as the Shekinah. And so whenever you mention the polar and solar shift, I couldn't help but think of the relationship that's taking place there, the Eros Gamos, or divine wedding, where this Holy Spirit, feminine spirit of sorts, is wedding itself to the male monad priests. And so I think you're actually seeing both there in some cases. So maybe in some cultures where it seems apparent that it's polar, there's solar is actually the cult or the mystery, and then maybe vice versa. See, so I kind of got that vibe as you were talking. It really surprised me. And I also thought too of like how Christ is a lot of times associated with the sun, and it dominates the sky, so you can even see the stars in the day, right? But then at nighttime you can see the stars, and the North Star dominates the stars at night. Of course, the moon has some competition, I'm sure. But then I would also equate Christ and Odin and those roles too, like where you got one hanging on the tree of the Sefirot above, and then one hanging on this the Klipa tree below, both associated with the Logos, and this sorts of things. So yeah, I had some thoughts going through my mind, and I felt like I was like, man, I'm in a tornado. How am I going to grab one question? but no, I actually I'd already had the rivers stuff written down. And then one more thought I had when you guys had the Emperor card up there a moment ago, I couldn't help but think too how that kind of aligns with the Sefirot itself, because after all, what is at the top of the Sefirot? The crown, Keter. And so you'll find the crown also on the top of the Emperor. And the implements of his office, the globus cruciger and the rod. If you notice, the rod itself is a Tau cross, which is a little unusual looking, right? But then it's got the circle. I think that might represent like the sun and the horizon, and maybe that this rod is also used for maybe finding stars, the sun, measuring angles, because the staff of Jacob is a device used that looks a lot like a cross, and that can be used for measuring the declination of stars, celestial objects, etc. And I think that whenever we see Saturn with his crutch, a lot of times that's kind of like a hat tip to this sort of thing too, this instrument, which was used for navigation. You mentioned the sailing and such. So I guess the question I had for you was like, do you feel like the universal man is kind of analogous to this Emperor card. Is he kind of representing more than just the earthly kingdom? Can he translate to the heavenly kingdom above in some way as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly right. I do see that, and it's interesting. So one of the things I think that makes sense to bring up is that this idea of quartering the land, just like how you see here, the rivers sort of quarter the land in a way, right? You have these different quadrants. This idea goes way, way back, and I find it really, really fascinating that when people established a land or founded a new land and they put in place a leader, a king of sorts, um, a lot of times what they would do is they would have a central point of pivot, a center to this region, right? And this gets into this science called centrography. And there's a book called At the Center of the World by John Michel, and he talks about this a lot. This is where I got a lot of this information from. And basically, they would find the center of the land, whatever it might be, however that might be dictated. It could be dictated by borders and other tribes, right, that have their own space. Or if you're on an island, then you would want to know sort of where this central location was. And this central location was like of supreme importance. And so oftentimes they would mark it with something. It wasn't uncommon to mark it with with a stone of some sort, to have some sort of central stone. Yeah, exactly. The follow stone you just put there in the chat. Exactly. So they would put a central stone there. Sometimes it could be a central tree. Sometimes they could put a temple there or something along these lines. And this was the center of the kingdom, essentially. And from there would emanate these lines, these 4 lines, north, south, east, and west. So now you've quartered the land and you've divided the land. And so this central stone was also referred to as a stone of proportions, a stone of division, a dividing stone, something along these lines. And so it's not unlike the stone to be related to the leader itself, that if you have a true leader, a true king, or a true lord, they are like a rock. They're a rock for the people. They give you a point of orientation, right? So they give you something to sort of revolve around spiritually and things of that sort. So rock symbolism very much comes into play with all of this. The rock in the center of the cross. And so the Hierophant, there's a lot of like Hierophant Pope symbolism with rocks and things like that, and stones and whatnot. And so the Lord is a symbolic rock, a symbolic point of pivot. And it wasn't uncommon too, with this dividing of the land into quarters, to actually have different things associated with different quarters. That's my understanding as well. And it wasn't uncommon to have different rituals with different quarters of the land kind of being pitted against each other. So as an example, the north versus the south, right? It's like, that's kind of interesting. This is like a dynamic that's been played out like multiple times throughout the world. The northern people versus the southern people, or the eastern people versus the western people. And so this quartering of the land could be used for like beautiful purposes, but it could also be used as like a divisive sort of thing as well, is what I've kind of come across.
Yeah, to interject really quickly,
Go for it.
One of my favorite shows of all time that really stuck with me as a kid, and I still talk about it to this day, and I constantly talk about it on any show that I do, is of course Avatar: The Last Airbender, which does the whole Messiah myth, of course, the whole Messiah archetype and all that. The other thing that it does is it does what you're talking about with putting these directions against each other, because the whole setup to the show is that there's these full nations for each element, and the Fire Nation wages war against the others, and that creates a separation. Even the northern and southern water tribes, who used to have communication through the poles, through the spiritual kind of connection through the poles, that they could talk to each other, they can't do that in the time of the show that the show takes place is wartime, because that separation has broken. And they even don't see each other as one kind of tribe anymore. The North is seen as like kind of the upper elite water tribe, and the southern pole is the kind of poor, kind of outskirts of the water tribe nation and all this. And so it's you see that in all kinds of different stories and everything, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
And
once that kind of came to mind, or once I came across that information, I was like, oh wow, that actually explains a few things, in
yeah,
my
I
opinion.
would even, another thing that we talk about on the channel is we always say that everything can be traced back to Shakespeare in some way. And I would kind of ponder the idea of Romeo and Juliet. Is that kind of like
Mm.
this, like think about the alchemical marriage of masculine and feminine. Is Romeo and Juliet kind of like the warning version of it, like where both ends, the masculine and feminine, are at odds with each other instead of being harmonious.
Right. Well, it's interesting. It's like that central point where the rock is, or in the middle of the cross, symbolically, it represents non-duality. It's like supreme unity. And so it's even almost like I've been using the wheel as a metaphor a lot lately. And you could even see here this graphic, it kind of looks wheel-like. The simplest wheel looks like a quartered circle. It looks like a circle with a cross inside of it, right? And so you're generally not going to see a 3-spoked wheel. You will see a 4-spoked wheel, a 6-spoked wheel, an 8-spoked wheel, a 10, 12, usually an even number, right? And so the center of the wheel is the most balanced part of the wheel. The external part of the wheel, the rim of the wheel or circumference of the wheel, is the least balanced part of the wheel. And so if you're going to be operating on the outside of the wheel, that's like operating on the outside of self. It's related to division and multiplicity and things like that. But the inside of the wheel, the hub or axis of the wheel, is where the reconciliation of opposites occurs, right? It's where there is that balance between masculine and feminine. So that's kind of what we're talking about, just almost inherently, is unification, supreme unification in the center, and then everything outside of that is actually related to division and duality and things of that sort, right?
Yeah, it also reminds me of, since we're talking about the center right now, Robert Bly and his book Iron John, a book about men. He discusses in Viking culture, in their houses, everything is from the center outwards, because the center of the fire is similar to like a Native American teepee kind of formation. And they have, a lot of times they will have their beds and everything where they live and stay around the edges of the house, and then the fire will be in the center. Then the in between space where the ashes would fall, that's where all the children will play. And that was known as the time of ash.
Oh wow.
And that's where we get the idea of like ash boys and cinder girls, which then gets us to like Cinderella, and this idea of the wild man and the wild woman. And it was common that in Viking culture, from Robert Bly's a book about Iron John, a book about men, he talks about how they just accepted that before the kids would reach puberty, they would play in the ashes of the fire, and they would have ash time, and they would be covered in ashes. And then one day, the boys, or the girls, would just get up and something would click in them, or be like, well, I'm done playing with ashes. And then that's when the boys would go on to hunt with the men, or the girls would go do something with the women, and that's when they would have like rites of passage rituals and everything. And I think it's interesting when we're talking about polar symbolism, this idea. It kind of goes back to when I showed the hero's journey. You see fire and earth is out on the bottom, and the water, air kind of on the ascent aspect of it. And so Robert Bly kind of talks about this. When it comes to the hero's journey, there is a descension, and then you have to go through fire and ash, and then there's an ascension. So it's kind of like the way of the phoenix. And I in relation to all of this, I know Rene Guenon talks about when it comes to the cross, that there's, like you said towards the beginning of the conversation, you have the vertical line, and then you have the horizontal line. Then there is another line, and that is another horizontal line, and that cuts to the center as well. And that is kind of relates to this idea of the if there's two pillars, there's always an invisible pillar. There's always a third.
Yeah.
So I was thinking maybe if you wanted to talk to us a little bit about this idea of a invisible pillar or a sacred pillar.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. So, I mean, if actually one of the like really interesting things, and the ash weave, by the way, is super fascinating. So thank you for putting that on my radar.
Yeah.
And so that actually reminds me just a little bit before I jump into that. Ash Wednesday being the day of Mercury being very liminal in between sort of realms or whatever. And it kind of just like reminds me of that sort of dynamic. And the center of the wheel is very much related to that unity, or the center of the TP or the house or whatever. It's that supreme unity. That's like symbolic of heaven in a lot of ways, the transcendental realm, and then the outer portion, right, being more so related to earth. So kind of being in between that ash sort of state. I think that's really, really cool. I like that for a few different reasons. But the sort of hidden pillar dynamic, I actually think it makes sense maybe to just go on over to slide number 7. It's actually right after this one. And it's a book that I came across years ago. And it's a great little book that explains a lot, in my opinion, if someone's looking for insights on cross symbolism. This author, Derek Bryce, acknowledges the world axis and like all of these other things, right? And he basically opens up the book and says that what predates the cross is actually just the standing stone. And so if you want to go to slide number 2 now, you'll just see a very simple standing stone somewhere in Europe, of which there's like many over there, not unlike this one, right? And so you have a very simple standing stone. This was that central stone for a lot of different communities and for a lot of different villages and little empires and things like that. And so this marked a central location. And so my understanding is that the vertical axis, this vertical pillar, symbolic pillar or phallus, literally predated the cross. And so before there was the vertical and horizontal arm of the cross, this is what it looked like, basically, right? And so this is what he says at the very beginning of his book. And he goes through all these different examples of standing stones throughout Europe and whatnot. And some of these got transformed into crosses or replaced with crosses and all these other things. But what I find to be really fascinating, if you want to go to the next slide, is that all throughout Europe, there are these little formations, and these are actually called crosses, right? And so isn't that interesting? Most people, when they see a cross or they see something referred to as a cross, they're going to expect the classic vertical and horizontal bar of a cross. These are called market crosses, and there's a ton of them throughout Europe. And they marked, right? They marked a central location, and this is where people would congregate as well. That was an important aspect to this centrography thing, is that you wanted to find this central point in the middle of the region so that people from around the region can come and congregate. And oftentimes they would have rituals there. They would have these different like festivals, and it was basically just a meeting place, essentially. And they would also, some of these places got turned into literally markets. So this would be a market cross, basically. And so this would be the symbolic sort of crossroads for the region as well. So if you're coming from the north, south, east, or west, you come to this central location. Now you're at the crossroads, right? And so some of these got turned into actual crosses as well. So if you go to the next slide, number 4, you can see another market cross, but instead now it actually literally has, you know, a cross on top of it. And so so whether it's just a vertical pillar that kind of looks phallic, or it actually has a cross on it, these are all considered market crosses. And so I think that's interesting too, because Mercury has a lot of symbolism with markets and merchant symbolism and stuff like that. And so merchant, Mercury, right? Exchange, exchange, right? There's a whole weave with crosses in the X as well, right? To exchange information, to exchange goods, to exchange resources, to come to the market cross, the crossroads, to you know, to basically sell and buy and whatnot.
Yeah.
And so you obviously can see now, if this is true, if this vertical pillar, this standing stone predates the cross, everything about the cross has to do with this ascension sort of dynamic, you know, in my opinion. And then even Christ being crucified on the cross, it's like, you know, this kind of falls in line with other dying god myths where the martyr or the savior has to go through this sort of you know, transformation. Odin, very similar, hanging from the world tree. The hanged man, he's hanging sometimes from a tree that looks very much like a cross, right? And so it's through this sort of trial and struggle are they able to really transmute and really change and transform into something greater than what they were sort of previously. But the cross, the reason why we use crosses, in my opinion, from what I've heard as well, you know, in graveyards and stuff like that, is because there is a dynamic with the cross and crossing over, right? So when you refer to ascension, you know, there's different ways of looking at it. And I think, you know, people should want to be in their body and kind of be okay being in this reality and accepting it sort of for what it is. But we will all cross over at some point. We're all going to go to the other side, right? And so whether you like it or not, death is going to come for you at some point. So the cross has something to do with crossing over to the underworld or to the afterlife, right? So this is always the thing. These two bars crossing each other, that central point being related to this vertical axis. And then I don't know, did we show the first slide yet?
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, this is a good point to bring that up. Awesome.
Right. So kind of like what I was saying earlier, you know, you have the X axis, the Y axis, and so then the axis that is vertical would be the Z axis here. So you can almost imagine the Z axis not being there, but then you still have this cross and the symbolism is still there, right? This vertical transcendental sort of axis is still present, even though it may not be highlighted like it is here.
Yeah. So that would be the invisible pillar, so to speak, then.
Yeah, that's how I see it, at least, for sure.
Okay. Joshua, did you have anything you wanted to add or ask?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I was trying to use a hotkey and it did something funny. So yeah, just seeing that right now, it kind of made me think too, the invisible pillar as Z, well, that might even represent like the altar in the middle. So we got
absolutely
plus ultra with the Jachin and Boaz being the two visible pillars, but then the third pillar could be the altar in the middle, maybe. And in the Masonic tradition, that's where you'll find the logos and the square and compasses as well, right? So and what they call the 3 lesser lights and 3 greater lights. So there could be some more to pull from there. But one of the other things I wanted to notice, you mentioned how Odin has this mercurial market thing. I really like that because one of the things I've read about Odin is he likes really straight, flat roads for his chariot. And so another connection to the commerce of highways, right? And and the importance of building forts along roads to protect commerce, and that's kind of like the duty of a emperor. And you know, the hospitalitors, the Knights Templar. There's a long tradition of that sort of thing where they wore the crosses, of course. But there's the also the King of the Four Corners comes to mind, because that this whole tradition of being able to divide the land, as it were. So whatever it was that did create the earth and humans or whatever, apparently did that initially, right? And so it's funny how we kind of repeat what the Augustan day, when it was just nothing but water, and then it's like the stake goes in the ground and the stake in the claim, right? And then we now repeat that same thing, you know, even today. And then in the story of the Bible, Joshua divided the land as well, in a certain manner. So when you were talking about that, it reminded me of that. And you know, you made that comment about the staining stones and the crosses. Well, in the Old Testament, when they built it, they had what was called the tent of meeting. And so when we think of the firmament and the stars and the axis mundi and this tent pole kind of symbolism, I can't help but think of the tabernacle and how that kind of fits into it, and how the altar itself is kind of like that tent pole, you know, so to speak, right? And so I see the cross sitting up on Golgotha, place of the skull, is kind of being emblematic of that tent pole as well, right? In a sense, like crucifying himself on the axis mundi, as it were. But this tent of meeting, I think that what's really kind of going on here is like the feast days were kind of in line with the spring, summer, and fall, but they would exclude the winter. And so I think when we see the cross and we notice how one of the legs on it is elongated, right, compared to the rest, typically. Of course, you can find egalitarian crosses, but typically there's one that's elongated, and I think that is, like you said, death comes for us all, right? So that might be like the death portion of it, where, you know, it's the long winter. That's when death comes for plants, animals, humans, whomever. But then in those three other sections of the year, you know, we have life abundant, sunshine, life, etc. And so I think there could be a kind of a nod there to that, because the Egyptians also used the crosses, of course, and had this eternal life aspects. And so I think that we might be seeing that there, and that the emperor himself is kind of the emblematic of this authoritarian figure who has the authority as well over the rule of law, the rule of the land, the law of the land. And so the implement that he's holding in his hand a lot of times would be about the length of the arm, correct? Mario, wasn't it standardized by the length of the ruler's arm a lot of times? So I think that's something to take in consideration as well, because when we read in Revelation, it talks about building the temple with a reed, for instance. Christ was given a reed prior to the crucifixion when they were mocking him, right? But that is what's actually going to be used to measure the temple, is like this reed. So this ruler. So I think it's funny we call our overseers rulers, but ruler is something used to measure, right? So they set the weights and measures, the commerce, the roads. I mean, so I think there's a lot kind of governed under the emperor. He's responsible for all the things statecraft, you know. So it's a lot of responsibility there from the throne. But anyway, yeah, those were just some of the things I wanted to mention. I mean, you guys know me, I could go on forever.
No, that was excellent, man. I love all of that. It reminds me of the measuring rod, right? I cut out for a second, so I'm not sure if you said that, but the rod being a symbolic pole or a pillar, right? A staff or a scepter, something along these lines. You know, something I wanted to mention as well is that one of the things that I've picked up about the world axis that I think is just worth relaying is that, like in Ovid's Metamorphoses, one of the first plates and one of the first sections is called Chaos, or the Chaos, and it has to do with the primordial universe. And there's an illustration basically where there is fire and there's stone and there's smoke and there's what looks like water, and there's all of the different signs of the zodiac and different parts of the ecliptic as well, and they're all broken, and everything is kind of in this hodgepodge sort of mess. You can't really like make sense of anything, but you can tell there's things there. It's almost like a puzzle that's been scrambled up, and all the puzzle pieces are in different parts of the canvas or whatever. This fits in line with other myths that I've heard that different cultures have, where the primordial universe, everything was amalgamated together, everything was mixed together, all of the different elements and whatnot were basically all smashed together. And this fits in line with this other idea that heaven and earth were essentially fused together, and that there was no separation between heaven and earth. And it wasn't until there was a symbolic world axis or central column that was created, or a central tree that was created, was there separation between the above and below because of this central pole, just like you're talking about, like the tent pole, right? And so the idea was that everything was in chaos until the world axis came about, this symbolic pillar that gave everything order, because now there is space between the above and below. So now there's actual 3D space for things to interact and actually have sort of their room to kind of do what they need to do. And then the central pillar also gave everything a point of pivot. So it went from chaos to order. And I think you actually see this kind of in the tarot with the Fool card to the Magician card. The Fool does have a chaotic sort of energy to him. He oftentimes is carrying this little bag at the end of a pole. People have said that within the bag could be the elements, it could be the signs, it could be these different things, but they're all mixed together. There's sort of no order or structure. You're also dealing with the zero, which can relate to chaos, I would say. And then this is followed by the Magician card, which is the first card of the major arcana. I'm inclined to think that literally the vertical line that indicates number 1 is literally the world axis itself. It's a polar symbol. And you have the Magician, he's holding his wand up to the heavens, and then he's pointing his hand down to the ground. And in my estimation, what he's really saying is, I connect to the above and below, I connect heaven and earth, and I also separate heaven and earth as well. So that's what the world axis ultimately represents. It's a separation between all that is above with all that is below, but it also connects all that is above with all that is below. And in actuality, we are all kind of like the Magician in that we connect heaven and earth, basically, right? That's kind of one of our roles here, is that we actually unify everything above and below. And so we are poles, basically. We're like walking poles. We call ourselves people, right? And so people have even said too that our sort of like etheric body is very polar. It's just like this like vertical sort of line. Like if you just imagine the chakras even, right? It's like a vertical pole, basically. Branch, were you going to say something?
Oh yeah, man. Thanks. Yeah, I did have a lingering thought concerning when Christ is talking to his disciples. He instructs them to take up their cross and follow him. So if he is indeed the king of the world, right? He's the scepter he's giving into his followers is the same thing that the emperor is holding, basically, right? He's telling them, pick up your cross. You're rulers, act like a king. You're in charge here. And also, Chris was mentioning this particular seal of Solomon earlier, and how it's like the two triangles kind of conjoined, uniting the elements, as it were, or the union of opposites. And so when you're talking about the marriage of heaven and hell, this sort of thing came to mind, where we see this in different ways, shapes, and forms in cultures. But for instance, in Hinduism, it's symbolized as like a vajra. And that too is like the union of two polar opposites. And so, but why would that be done, right? So, yeah, everything was together in one when it was in this monad, or when the rudiments or the elements were all one. But when disparity came and difference and duality, that too then became like the energy flow was then possible, just like you got two energetic poles. And so by forcing two things together like that, you create actually an energetic current. And so I think part of what we see with the seasons changing, as it were, every year, that's part of this, I guess, the physics, as it were, of how it all operates, right? It's like a big engine when you think about it. And so if it wasn't churning and turning and changing like that, we would have a dead planet like the moon or Mars or something like that, perhaps, right? So I guess there's something to that, probably, right? That this churning back and forth. And so if it weren't for that unification piece, those two things may not naturally come together, right? They might disperse.
Right.
And so there's some type of harnessing of those forces when the union's brought together like that. And for me, that's just, it's kind of profound, really, because when you think about it, the human is kind of that way too. Like the omphalos navel stone we mentioned earlier is where our lower nature, like the serpent legs that you see on some of those depictions of art, we've talked about that a lot in the past. But the serpent legs are like the lower nature, right? And then the higher nature of the human, they're both joined in the middle, right? Fused like that. So I think whenever we kind of hear like the tabernacle is modeled after the human body and those sorts of things, it's like Chris was saying earlier, there's layers to this symbolism. In fact, he's got a nice picture there on the screen. So where you see those squares with the triangle on top, that's very reminiscent of the apron that's worn over the genitalia. And of course, this also depicts very well how the Israeli tribes were kind of aligned, right? So in the middle there would be where you had like your Levite priests and the altar and everything was located there. But yeah, that's packed with a bunch of symbolism, of course. We don't have to go into it, but the Masonic tools are there. And you mentioned stones a lot earlier. So I think the whole thing about just construction in general is very important. And when I was in Lodge the other day, they announced how there was a couple of places laying keystones. And I had just forgotten about that. And I thought, oh, how cool that was. So there's like this privilege of laying that foundation stone, right? And I've even heard that referred to as the black rock sometimes.
Oh, nice.
Which, really suspicious to me. But in some cases too, this is where we would get like the Grim Kirk, or the Holy Spirit that would inhabit the temple would be actually an animal or something that was buried beneath the altar alive, and then it would haunt the temple. So, like a lamb would be buried under the altar in a church, or a dog or something like that. And then it was thought that spirit would kind of linger around and protect it. So when you think about what Christ's crucifixion on the cross, I see that too as like a Grimkirk ritual where the Holy Ghost then haunts the earth, right? Kind of similarly. Anyway.
Yeah. Wow. Very interesting. I just want to point out, because that cross is reminding me as well. It's not exactly the same thing, but you can you'll see what I'm saying. The cross unfolds like a cube, right? Or the cube unfolds like a cross, rather. And so there's a natural relationship with the cross and the cube. And so I think that that's interesting in and of itself. And all of the Abrahamic religions have this interesting relationship with it. With Christianity, it's obviously the fact that the cube unfolds like a cross. In Judaism, you have literally the six-pointed star, which basically is like the silhouette of a cube. Basically, you can make a very simple cube if you just connect the tips, and then dead center in the middle is one of the corners of the cube. So you can overlay a cube onto the six-pointed star. And then in Islam, you literally have the Kaaba cube itself, right, as well. So there's this natural relationship with the cube as well. And then it also relates to the three axes as well, or axes, because the cube, symbolic of space, is what I've read. And I believe maybe Guenon went into that with Symbolism of the Cross, but with the cube, you have the 6 different panels. So you have forward, backward, left, right, up, and down, right? So all of the different parts of the of space are acknowledged. And then I was going to say, I like the fact that there is a 5-pointed star in the middle of the cross, because the middle of the cross represents the number 5, in my opinion. There's this 5th point in the middle, basically. So there's this inherent relationship with the number 5 in the cross as well, because it represents that sacred center. And sure enough, they're putting it right there at the sacred center too.
Yeah. Because we always bring things back to movies and TV shows here on this channel. For to quickly go over a couple examples of what we're talking about that I think that people can draw reference to if they consume a lot of visual media. I would reference again when you're talking about being a person being their own pole and being their own bridge. I would again like to point back to Avatar: The Last Airbender. One of the things I always say that was the main lesson to that show was that everyone is their own avatar, right? Everyone has their own, because the whole point of being the avatar was the avatar is, of course, is the messiah for their world, but he is also the bridge between the spiritual world and the humans in the physical world, and they even call him the bridge. And they sometimes even sarcastically they might go, "Oh, well, he's the great bridge," like,
oh wow,
that we are, we that is also our role. And then of course, Aang has his tattoos of the arrows that go out in every direction. So we have that kind of cross expanding out kind of symbolism in his tattoos. And then, as I mentioned in the cosmology of their universe, they have their northern and southern pole have been kind of separated spiritually, and it takes the next incarnation of the Avatar, which is Avatar Korra. Her thing is that she recombines the spiritual world and the humans, and she basically lifts the veil by opening up the poles so that people could just walk when they walk into where the northern and southern poles are. They're walking into the spiritual world, essentially. And so we have that. And then the other thing I wanted to make a quick reference to, and is why I kept this diagram up, is in another. I'm talking a lot about animated stuff right now. I know. Talking about Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, which I just did another video on the channel. There's a in particular scene where they're meeting all the spider society of the spider people across the all across the Spider-Verse meet, and Spider-Man 2099, who's like a Blade Runner Spider-Man from the future. He's the acting leader of the Spider Society, and he's trying to explain to the rest of the Spider people what the idea of the multiverse. And he brings them into like this holodeck kind of space, and then it's all black, and then one little bright dot falls, and they ask him what it is, and he goes, "Well, that's everything. Like, this one dimensional dot is literally everything." And then it falls and it gets planted into the ground, and it expands into a tree, and that becomes like the tree of, yggdrasil, or the tree in the Garden of Eden, whatever you want to refer to it as. And then from that point, so the dot is the one dimension, the tree could be like the 2 dimension, and then from that point it expands in every direction and becomes a spider web. And that's when he says, "Well, that's the Spider-Verse." And he explains that where the nexus points, or where the knots or the spider web cross, those are canon events. Those are moments that have to happen in in the world, like Spider-Man getting inspired by Uncle Ben dying and all that. Like these are canon events that have to happen. That makes me think of Rene Guenon in the book Symbolism of the Cross. He talks about the Celtic cross in particular, to bring. In fact, I'll bring this book back up for reference. On the cover there, Celtic crosses have knots similar to a spider web, and he brings up this whole idea of weaving, and I think that's very interesting. So I was going to ask you, Mario, about on this idea of Celtic knots and the symbolism of weaving. What does that mean to you in your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, so the power of the knot is in its ability to bind and then also loosen. So I would say, in a way, kind of like conceal and reveal. And I would say kind of relates to like a lock in a way, right? The same thing with the lock. The lock, its power is to bind and then also free, essentially. So the knot very much plays a part in that. And then weaves as well, very feminine generally is how I typically see it. A lot of like the weavers in mythology are females. And you know, I think of the fact too that like braiding hair is relating to like weaving and knotting as well, and that's like more of a feminine thing traditionally. And then there's also like this weaving dynamic as well, like with the moon, and there's a whole symbolic thread with that. Actually, I have a moon card where there's actually a woman with a spindle and she's weaving things. And so so I think about all of that stuff personally, but the spider dynamic of what you brought up is so fascinating to me too, because of the symbolic, you know, relationship with a spider being a weaver, right? And so I've heard you, maybe we've talked about this at some point, but several people that I've come across and people I've talked to like in person, like friends and things like that, there's a whole entire thing with basically some people thinking that if there's going to be like a creature of the modern world that symbolically represents the modern world, several people have made the case that it's eight-legged, that it's either the octopus or it's the spider itself. And I have a friend that's way into this whole entire thread, basically, of the spider kind of being the symbolic totem animal of like the modern age and whatnot.
Yeah,
And I think that can kind of make sense. Go ahead.
yeah, the reason why I did another video on spider stuff recently was because I found out that Rudolf Steiner, I don't know how familiar you are with his work. He kind of was prophetic in a way and mentioned that, or he was a self-claimed clairvoyant, and he gave a prediction that a great spider entity would come out of like the Americas in the future and encase the entire world within its web, and would give us all the knowledge of man, but it would separate us from spirituality. It would completely consume us into a materialistic world. And the way he describes it sounds a lot like the internet
Right.
and everything. So
Yeah.
I think what you're hinting at there could have some merit to it, because we see it in so many different places.
Yeah.
Or did you have something to add?
Oh, I mean, no, just I completely agree with you. Yeah, the World Wide Web, obviously, right? And so also there's some like interesting world axis symbolism, in my opinion, with spiders and stuff. So like when you see a spider hanging from a thread, I think that's really interesting because in Freemasonry, I've read it several times now, that the plumb line also is symbolic of the world axis. So just like the cord with the weight at the end of it, right? And it measures like what's true. And so even like in the Bible, at some point, God uses his plumb line to measure the righteousness of Israel, and Israel is crooked, right? He likens it to like a crooked wall, and the plumb line is going to show you if it's completely perfectly vertical or not, right? And so the plumb line has also been used in some Freemasonic iconography to essentially just allude to the world axis, in my opinion. So when I see a spider hanging from a thread like that, it kind of reminds me of that a little bit, right? It's almost like this plumb line of God or this world axis. And then I just think of like a spider hanging out in the middle of a web as well. It kind of just reminds me of another sort of world axis, sacred center sort of symbol too. So there's a few things going on like that I think are interesting. But go ahead.
Yeah. Well, my next question, I kind of went on a spider tangent there.
All good, man.
My next question would be, and this to me, this is one of the most interesting things that you talk about in your work for me, especially because how it's viewed in the modern times is kind of inverted or perverse in a way than what it really is, and that is the idea of the swastika being a cross and it connecting to the North Star and all that. So I didn't know if you wanted to get into a little bit of that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm always down. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I noticed early on when I started looking into the symbolism of the swastika is I was referencing a lot of more modern books, I guess. And if you look into a lot of modern books on symbolism, most of them will say that the swastika is a solar symbol. They will usually say that. They'll say that it's like a solar wheel or something along these lines. And I never thought that that made sense personally. And some of my favorite resources basically said otherwise and said that it wasn't based on the sun, that it's actually a polar symbol. And when I started digging into those resources that would say this, that it's more of a polar symbol than a solar symbol, oftentimes they're referencing Rene Guenon and things like that. But he wasn't the first person to say this. And especially further east, there's so much documentation that this is what they thought as well with the swastika. But essentially, it's Ursa Major going around the pole star. And if you just look at Ursa Major, if that was the primordial sky clock, people were paying attention to its rotation throughout the year. And so if you acknowledge Ursa Major through the year, and you look at it once a quarter, then it does create the swastika. And so in my opinion, I'm inclined to think that this is also where we get the shape of the number 7 from, because we're dealing with the 7 stars of Ursa Major. So if you look at a swastika, it kind of looks like 4 sevens basically just connected at the axis, right? And so so that's what I think it ultimately represents. The center of it would be the world axis, and it's basically the spinning of the stars around the pole star, basically. And so these 7 stars are like of supreme importance. They've been referred to as many, many, many different things. And I'm getting ready to do a presentation called On the Origin of the Zodiac. And my personal opinion now is that all of the symbolism that we associate with the zodiac signs come from the northern sky. And I've done presentations on several of the signs through this lens. I did one on Libra. I called it the axis of Libra. Even I think the planetary symbolism, I think ultimately comes more than likely from the northern sky as well. But I've done one on Libra through that lens. I've done stuff related to Aquarius and how it relates to the North Star and things like that. And so what I think happened basically was that people acknowledged the northern sky. They were paying attention to it. They had a lot of myths associated with this portion of the heavens. When people became more solar, they basically shifted the mythology of those signs to the path of the sun, essentially, right? And so there's a guy named John Major Jenkins. I reference him all the time because he writes about it very clearly. But he basically says that according to his research in ancient China, they had 8 constellations in the north, all around the pole star. And when they shifted to paying attention to the sun more, they basically brought all of those same constellations, the same mythology, they shifted those constellations to the path of the sun, and then they added 4 more constellations, giving them 12 zodiac signs, basically. And so I think that that basic sort of framework or idea is true probably across the world. That's just my hunch, and we're so far removed from that. Most of this stuff is completely lost on people, right? And understandably so, kind of given everything. He also said that they had 8 constellations up there because they associated each constellation with one trigram. And so when they were developing the I Ching, right? So you have yin and yang, the yin and yang stacking of yin and yang 3 different times, 3 different lines. You create 8 trigrams, and then you combine those 8 trigrams to give you 64 hexagrams, right? And so he's mentioned that. Guenon has mentioned that. I think one of the big things as well that you can really look into, he has an article called "The Wild Boar and the Bear," and basically he makes the case that the symbolism of Ursa Major in today's world heavily got shifted over to the Pleiades, and that we refer to the Pleiades as like the 7 sisters, right? And that the symbolism essentially was inherently connected to Ursa Major, like in primordial times. So I think, just like how I mentioned earlier, this shift away from the north, this migration away from paradise or Eden, or this casting out or whatever you want to say, this fall from grace from the center, I think it more than...
Oh.
Did I cut out there?
Yeah, just for a moment. You're back.
Yeah, just for a moment.
Yeah.
I thought I was scared. I thought it was me for a second. We have really strong winds today.
Okay.
The glories of living in what's called the Tornado Alley, talking about tornadoes and being,
I see.
I guess, a version of poles. So I was like, oh, is it me? Is it the wind?
No, it's on my end.
Okay.
So I think that basically the same way humanity likely migrated away from the north, or had a fall from grace from the north, or got cast out of Eden, or whatever you want to say, moved away from the center. I think my very, very strong hunch, based on all of my research, is that the exact same thing happened in the heavens. That the genesis or origin story of a lot of the myths, perhaps literally all of the myths on the zodiac, and maybe even just in the night sky, came from the northern sky first and then migrated away from there over time. And so it's kind of no different than like the growth rings of a tree. It's like, they all start from the center and they all emanate from the center and work their way outward. Same thing with like ripples, in a body of water. You throw a stone in a body of water, it creates ripples, and they all ripple out from the center. I think that that's probably what happened in the night sky as well, is that there is this rippling dynamic away from the northern sky. But that the origins of all of these different stories, I just can't ignore the fact that they all feel very northern and polar to me. And so the more I do deep dives into the signs, the more I'm inclined to think that this is the case.
Yeah. And I guess you can also say how you mentioned earlier about like the warning directions, like east and west and everything. Think about how I know I've seen some of your presentations where you've shown in Eastern countries where they have the swastika on like taxis or on
right
on the Buddha, and so it's seen both in Eastern countries and in Northern countries and all this. So we see, so it's kind of interesting that all of that then now we associate it with World War II, and the warning of all the different cardinal directions in the world. I guess you could say that was World War II.
Right,
sure.
Right. Well, what's interesting about that, I'm glad you're bringing it up. And I'll tread lightly here. But to me, it's fascinating that Germany invaded Poland, right? Poland. And then, of course, the swastika played its role in World War II. And then notice that it's the Allies versus the Axis, right? The axis of evil. Whenever you hear Axis on the world stage, it's always associated with evil now. So Iran is now the axis of evil. That was the last time I heard about it in the news. I don't follow the news too closely anymore. So I think that there's been this very deliberate sort of smearing of polar northern symbolism, right? And so that's kind of just my 2 cents, very, very briefly, with that, for
Yeah.
what it's worth.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Branch, is there a question or anything that you would like to add right here?
Yeah. So this thing about the seasons, you were talking about the 8 and stuff, but then what it reminded me of, though, was how in Japan they actually have 72 seasons.
Mm.
And that reminds me of the Shem Ham Mephoresh, of course, which is the 72 Goetia entities all around the year. So basically, we're dealing with each 5 degrees around the zodiac as well. And so, of course, each one's aligned with a star, etc. And what I think is really interesting about what you were talking about earlier with the Ursa Major and Minor making the swastika, basically. Well, around that too is Butez with Arcturus, and the North Star changes, of course, sometimes, but that particular star would herald the ripening of like figs and other sorts of species. For some tribes, it would even herald like the coming of ant larvae, which were a food source or something like that. And so, like when they could see this star, okay, now we can go eat ant larvae. And then when it went away, the ant larvae went with it. So I think it's kind of interesting too how we don't really probably understand what's going on with the subtle energies that are being emitted from these stars, planets, so on and so forth, and how they really affect the clock, the biological clocks of creatures here on Earth. I always like to talk about the animal clock, like that there, if you just pay attention to nature, there is a clock kind of taking a clock of sorts taking place all around us, with those. But the one other thought I had that I wanted to share was you mentioned this. You were talking about the pole stuff a moment ago and the axis and all that. Well, I was just thinking a moment ago, we have electricity and magnetism. Well, you only have your magnetism with which? North and south pole. We don't ever deal with east and west with magnetism.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but what do we deal with magnetism? The sun. So I think electricity, as it were, because you can get electricity from the solar panels and stuff too. So I think by nature, the solar is more electric from east to west. And then the polar itself is more magnetic, perhaps. And so in that fashion, maybe because femininity is typically described as magnetic, right? So maybe
Right.
there's a male and female thing there going on there too. And that what we're really seeing here is the joining of, because electricity and magnetism do have a relationship. You can create electrical fields with magnetism and vice versa. So I think the joining of these two, well, these 4 opposites, really, 2 opposites on every extreme, but you got the double Vajra symbolism too in Hinduism and Buddhism, where it's not just one Vajra of 2 joined opposite forces, but a lot of times you'll see 4 Vajra where they're all joined in the center. And I think that kind of represents like whatever has managed to be achieved by this wonderful place we call Earth. Like part of the construction of it, the balance that's taking place is the balance of these natural forces. Even like I think it's hard for us to even really appreciate what the hell's going on here, honestly. But yeah, I wanted to share that because for me that was very profound about the those forces. And so which is the axis, right? So when we're referring to the axis of evil, are we really referring to like the axis mundi, the pole element here, the magnetic element? And so you get into Vril and the Nazis, of course, again, and all sorts of topics like that. So I think Vril might be like this dark electricity or magnetic electricity type thing that was kind of explored a little bit by some of these people in the past. But and that might be what some of these ancient civilizations ran on, right? Like maybe in the polar age, they were using more vril. Now we use more like electricity from East-West tradition type stuff, right?
Right,
Anyway,
right.
go.
Dude, you're onto it, man, with a lot of things. I just want to add as well, just to your weave here with magnetism and all of that. I brought up the magician and how the magician is the symbolic sort of like axis, symbolic pole. Even the magician card corresponds with Beth or Bet, which means house. And so essentially the way I interpret it is he's saying, I am the central pillar in the house of God. And even when you look at a dome, right, which adorn a lot of cathedrals and mosques and things like that, the dome has a symbolic central pillar. Even if you can't see it, that's like essentially what's always sort of implied, in my opinion. The dome is the home, so you're referring to the firmament there. And so magician, magnetism, right? So there's a lot of magnetic symbolism that strongly associates with Mercury, right? Mercury being androgynous, masculine and feminine. We're talking about just gender, basically. A lot of Hermetic philosophy things go back to duality and black and white and gender symbolism and whatnot, yin and yang and what have you. And then also I was just going to say regarding sort of the kind of esoteric Nazi side of things, they're always associated with the black sun, right? And so the black sun, to me, I interpret the sort of everyday sun that rises and sets, rises in the east, sets in the west, that is the rotating sun. And I see the black sun as being like the stationary sun, basically, that there is a northern polar dynamic with the black sun, that it's actually a stationary idle sun. That is one of the biggest things that relates to the world axis, is that it's immutable and it's idle. But as it relates to the wheel as well, it's like when you get to the center of yourself, when you get to the center of the wheel, you become what's referred to as like the motionless mover, or the unmoved mover, or the prime mover. And so by getting to the center of self, or the center of the wheel, you cause the wheel to turn, even though you are stationary, right? And you're actually not moving. You're sort of this immutable stationary axis sort of thing.
Yeah,
I just wanted to throw that out there. Go for it.
I was gonna say, I'm glad you brought that up, because that gets the idea of like enlightenment and and the universal man. You think about how all the enlightened Buddhas and all kinds of different monks and all kinds of spiritual quests that people have gone on. So I'm glad you brought that up. Since we're kind of getting back to this idea of masculine and feminine and the alchemical marriage and all that kind of stuff, I have a bit of an odd question for you, Mario. So this might be a bit of a curveball here. If in Rene Guenon's book, The Symbolism of the Cross, he talks about this idea of like Adam, Eve, and this whole how they represent duality and everything. That makes I started to ponder a little bit on this idea of Lilith being like this third factor in this kind of relationship, and that I was just curious if you would possibly consider Lilith in the way of being the third pillar, or one of the three pillars.
Interesting. To be honest with you, I hadn't thought about that. But I mean, I see, it's funny because I always refer to the third pillar as well, but I catch myself sometimes, and I actually think that it's either the third pillar or the first pillar. It's like either the third, or like the original, pretty much,
Yeah.
right? And I see the original pillar, this original axis, on one level, I do see it as being related to non-duality. So there isn't really a gender specific thing associated with it. Because I see, as an example, with the world axis and then also the northern sky, like there's just as much, and maybe I could be wrong on this, but it seems as though there's just as much symbolism related to God, and like as a masculine or patriarchal sort of figure. Like the throne of God is often said to be in the northern sky. But the more and more and more I dig, the more and more and more I see that there's a huge feminine correspondence there. So much so that it just makes me wonder if the axis back in primordial times or during the golden age was actually viewed as being more feminine in nature.
Yeah.
I see this as making sense for a few different reasons. As an example, like in today's world, like the heart of the home symbolically, I would say, is the kitchen, which goes back to what you were saying about the fire being like the hearth, the central fire in the house of the home. Well, who's more associated with the kitchen than woman, than the feminine, right? Obviously, there's exceptions to every single dynamic, especially in today's world. But I would say that the woman symbolically really strongly relates to the world axis. She is sort of the glue between, all parties of the family, the children and the husband and things like that. I was even thinking about it today in terms of like world axis symbolism. Like there's a huge relationship here with pilgrimage locations being symbolic poles, right? So Mecca is a symbolic pole. So no matter where you're at in the world, you're praying towards Mecca. And it's your duty as a Muslim to go and have that pilgrimage at some point in your life, right? So then what do? You go to Mecca, you go around the Kaaba cube 7 times. What is the Kaaba cube? The Kaaba cube is feminine. It's literally Kaaba means the house of the mother, and it's very heavily tied to Virgo symbolism as well. So literally that black and gold that you see on the Kaaba cube, it's literally a veil. It's called the kiswa. And so everything about the Kaaba is feminine. There's even that silver piece on one of the corners that has a stone inside of it. It looks very much like a yoni, right? And you have people from all over the world, Muslims, and they are like revering just this central piece, this silvery yoni sort of thing, and they put their face in it and they're going nuts for it. And so there's a heavy feminine correspondence with the pole. And I was even thinking about it too. It kind of reminds me, or any pilgrimage location, whether it's in Israel or it's a temple or it's a sacred mountain or a tree or whatever. And so they every pilgrimage location that you might go to operates as a symbolic pole or a symbolic axis. And I see that you can make the case that there's a feminine correspondence with that, basically.
Yeah. I know you talked about I could be misquoting you. I believe I've heard you talk about the pole at the top of the pole star. There's the goddess of the pole star. I think you referred to it at one point, possibly.
Oh yeah. I see the woman in the star card as being that, even the Virgin Mary, she at one point she was referred to as Stella Maris, which means star of the sea. And in my opinion, it makes sense that it would be the North Star more than any other star, personally. So so I say all of that basically to say that there is a middle path, middle pillar relationship with the feminine. And so Lilith being sort of that central pole, I'll definitely give it some more thought, but I can see that, kind of making sense. Even as well, just another example, quick example. We always refer to justice as Lady Justice. And the justice card, the classic thing is that she is sitting between 2 pillars. She is symbolically that central pillar, basically. That's what she represents. And she's kind of the guardian of that sort of gateway between the 2 pillars. And woman is like the real gateway here. And there's a lot of gateway symbolism with the northern sky and this central pillar, original pillar, world axis kind of dynamic, right?
Yeah, the branch and I have talked about this amongst ourselves. We talk, on our channel, we talk about archetypes and storytelling and all that. And a modern trope is the manic pixie dream girl. I don't know if you're familiar with that trope or not.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a much more modern trope. That's how I usually, when it's something more ancient, I will call it an archetype, and more modern, I will refer to it as a trope to differentiate it in my own mind. And it's something more modern, but it has its connections to older ideas and everything. And we was pondering the idea of the manic pixie dream girl because it's arisen in present day from our understanding. Because of the lack of male initiators for young men, and so they're looking to be initiated, and then they find a bohemian hippie, kind of wild woman to initiate them, and she becomes the manic pixie dream girl trope. And we related to it as like the branches refer to it as like the horror of Babylon and everything. And in my mind, I refer to it as kind of a Lilith kind of archetype as well. And that made me think of Adam and Eve was, you know, as the first man and woman. Lilith kind of being that manic pixie dream girl, the original, and
Right.
being kind of proving, kind of putting that fire in Adam to his detriment, of course, and then having to, uh, you know, come up with Eve, this kind of more, I guess you can say, idealistic, more harmonious version of woman. And so that's why I brought it up, because it kind of I thought kind of fit in line of your work.
No, yeah, dude, you're totally right. Just real quick, as you were saying that, when you began talking, I wrote down Lilith equals Dark Mother, because in the occult world, basically, what I found is that this northern goddess is strongly associated with Dark Mother symbolism. Basically, is what I was going to get at, and then you're kind of completing the loop pretty much with everything, and so. So the Typhonian tradition, that's like very much in line with this stuff. The Whore of Babylon, right? She's always writing a 7-headed beast, of all things 7. When you're talking about like even like Babylon, like what like a lot of like Thelemic people and Crowleyan people, right, kind of revere. Babylon has 7 letters. It's a 7-pointed star. There's even 7s all in the sigil and stuff like that. And it's like, you're talking about northern symbolism, in my opinion. There's like no way you're not, basically.
Yeah.
And so, and then that she corresponds very strongly to a couple of cards in the tarot. One would be the strength card, and then the other one would be the star card, in my opinion. It's the same woman, basically. So yeah, absolutely. I see what you're saying now. Yeah, that I can see that, you know.
Yeah. We're getting to about the 2-hour mark in the next 20 minutes or so. So so we're getting to our closing thoughts here. The last thing I wanted to bring up, it is St. Patrick's Day week here well, we recorded it, but I'm going to be releasing this around Easter time, for the season and everything. And in between now and then, on top of Easter and spring and the equinox and all of that, there is also, I believe it's March 24th or 23rd, maybe 25th, one of those 3 days, is the allegedly the last day of the Kali Yuga. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
I'm familiar with the Kali Yuga, but not that this is the last day or it's coming up.
Yeah, it's supposed to be coming up. It's like March 23rd, 4th, or 5th. One of those 3 days is supposed to be the final day in that cycle. The catch is there's, from my understanding, there's always 2 Kali Yuga stacked up. So we're ending one Kali Yuga to start another Kali Yuga. Is how, I could be wrong, but that's how I understood it. That there's like a double stacking or something. So we're on the descending one, and we're starting the ascending one, I believe, in the cyclical Yuga calendar, at least, is how I've currently understand it. And on that topic, because the Yugas are cyclical in nature, and we're approaching spring and all that, and that being a circular kind of symbolism. Is there anything in that kind of field that you wanted to that you could add to, Mario?
Yeah. One of the things that I picked up, and this is more of like a broad sort of thing about the Kali Yuga, is I am going to refer back to Rene Guenon on this one, and what he says about the Kali Yuga, that the difference between this great dark age and the last golden age, or what, he also and other people have referred to as like this primordial tradition. The big difference is literally the loss of the symbolic center, pretty much. He says that is the big difference, is that during this golden age, as we started off with this conversation talking about the center and how that was of supreme importance, representing unity and all these other things, and that in the dark ages, that's what people have sort of no awareness for. And so people therefore are then off center, and they're away from this sort of supreme unity or whatever. And so so when he brought that to my attention, I'm like, that makes a lot of sense. And I recently read another one of his books called The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times. And basically what he says is that as we get further and further and further into these dark ages, because man is further and further away from this supreme unity or center, that the reign of quantity goes through the roof. So then everything becomes quantifiable pretty much. And so then people put numbers and attach numbers to everything, right? So not everything can be bought, right? Everything has a price, right? You're just a cog or a number in a machine, if you will. Back in the golden age or primordial tradition, it was the complete opposite, basically, right? People were more spiritually in line and in tune and centered and grounded and things like that. So that's what I would say, is that is definitely a pattern that I'm acknowledging right now. Just everywhere around me, I kind of see this as being the case, especially once I read the book. And I'm like, I think that actually makes a lot of sense, from technology to just how people view everything, scientism and sort of the modern world, like how it is when things reduce in quality, which is related to more of the spiritual essence, quantity goes up, right? And so that to me seems like it's definitely the case.
Dude, before I let the Brants do his piece on this, I like to briefly just point out that what you're talking about could be shown in a weird way. I think so. On the day of the last day of the Kali Yuga, like I said, the March 23rd, 4th, or 5th, or whenever it is, that's the same day that the new Snow White live action movie is coming out. And if anyone follows Hollywood and the current climate landscape that Hollywood is, you would know that the live action Snow White has been put through what was, I guess you could refer to as production hell. And it's because they're, you could say that they're wokeifying it, right? They've made Snow White into a strong woman and steer her away from the idea of true love and all this and that. So it's a movie of its times. And it also has lost a lot of money because of all the CGI and all the reshoots and everything. So what you're talking about the quality and quantity and everything you're talking about right now, I think could be symbolized in that you have this Snow White adaptation that's completely been changed to where the story isn't the same story. So the message isn't there from the Grimm's brother version or even the original Disney version. And now it's something that's of its modern times, that it only has dollar signs because it's nostalgic or it's a known IP, and they're putting this modernity lens on it, or this and that, whatever you want to call it. So I think, and I always joke that Snow White was going to usher in the Kali Yuga because the movie's coming out on the last day of the Kali Yuga, and you have her on the white horse, and she bites the apple and all this and that. So I was making jokes about it and all this and that. But I think what you're describing, if we're taking what you're describing as a macro thing, and then we zoom in and look at it as a micro thing, I think that could be one example. So I just wanted to mention that briefly. Brant, is there anything that you wanted to add for our closing thoughts here?
Yeah, man, I had a few notes. Forgive me, I know when I interject, it's like just like boom, 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 and then it's like, okay. But I do have a few notes here. So when Mario was talking about all the 7 symbolism that's rife throughout, like Lady Babylon, if you'll notice, they group those 7s in such a manner that you kind of have 3 3, 3 again, where those feast days are, and then the fourth would give you 28 days, or the period of the moon, right? Which is also very symbolic of blood loss and all that, which has happened a lot in Revelation. So thanks for helping me make that connection. That was pretty interesting to me. Something else that was very profound is, while we were talking about magnetism, it occurred to me, I was reading it, and it said that there's actually a right hand rule in magnetism, and that you use your right hand to determine the direction of the field and how it moves. So even though it's invisible and we can't see it, there is a rule to the force, and that's the feminine force that we typically associate with that, right? But then in some cases, like for instance with the story of Magnus the shepherd, Pliny the Elder says there's this boy that's out shepherding his sheep. What could be more Aries than shepherding sheep? And that the iron nails in his shoe and whatever he had on his staff was magnetically attracted to all the lodestone that was in the area where he was herding the sheep, and that's how we discovered magnetism. Well, very masculine sort of story when it's traditionally feminine, right? So I thought that was kind of interesting, because we were kind of flip-flopping them, right? But I think some of that flip-flops just because the poles can do that, right? And as far as Lilith is concerned, to answer your question, Chris, one of the reasons, well, at least the primary reason anyway, that Lilith was kicked out of the garden prior to Adam and Eve was that she wanted to assume the role that man would assume during sex. And so she is both masculine and feminine. And so I think in that way, she is that third pillar, in the sense that she's both male and female. And that might be kind of where we get this androgynous stuff, right? That kind of usually follows that sort of thing, right? And then, the plumb line you mentioned as well, that too has a right hand rule, because that's used to measure perpendiculars. And so you can only have a right angle with perpendiculars. And so the plumb line's meant to, just like the square is used to measure right angles, the plumb line is used to measure the erectness or straightness of something, right? So in Lodge, we're told to admonish ourselves in such a way that we keep our back straight and stand up straight, deal straightforward with people, etc., not be crooked in our dealings, so on and so forth. So there's this uprightness or righteousness that's kind of associated with that plumb line, and the right angles and the 90 degrees, which of course the sun cross or the swastika or whatever we're going to call it, it's got 4 of those, right? So I find that peculiar. And then the one last thought I had there from what you guys were saying, this dark age and golden age is one of the reasons maybe that wisdom was so ubiquitous in the golden age, was because everybody had a crown chakra that maybe was active, and that we had this morphogenic resonance of sorts where the collective unconscious was actually shared and enjoyed by everybody. And maybe we had access to it kind of similarly to how we have access to the internet today. Instead of Google, tell me this, maybe it was Muse, tell me this, Oracle, tell me this. And so I think it's kind of interesting to think about that, is that maybe we're just so disconnected from spirit nowadays that, it kind of has this hokey myth, fable feel to it, when in fact that's probably more real than the world we're experiencing today. And and the one last thing you mentioned about the quantification of everything as we move into that Kali Yuga phase, that dark MAGA kind of element of technocracy and quantification. Well, what they're talking about now is the tokenization of everything with Bitcoin and these types of digital assets, where they're going to tokenize the damn air and the soil and everything around you, and I think what you're talking about there really does drive that point home, where we're going to have to go through that super materialistic era before we come out on the other end. And then that's going to be that abundance, in terms of knowledge, resources, etc. But I just can't help but wonder, is that really what the cross kind of represents in a sense, to kind of bring it back, is that this endless, this is nothing new, right? Like, it's happened before, it's going to continue happening. And I think the cross is kind of emblematic of that. The only constant is change.
Mm-hmm. Right on, man. Excellent stuff. That was a great weave to end on there.
Yeah.
Perhaps if I had any final closing thoughts, I just want to mention that because we're talking about the cross and everything else, and Aries season coming up and just all of that, I see it that Christ was symbolically, at least, more so associated with mercurial symbolism. And Mercury relates to the crossroads, right? There's the Hermetic cross. And Mercury really is a traveler between realms, right? He's the messenger of the gods. And so I see it that he travels between realms via the world axis, which would be the symbolic center of the cross, right? And so I see that if we're going to look at things from like a planetary level, I think Christ was very mercurial. And then now I see in more so today's world, he's more so associated with the sun. And then the other thing I just want to mention is this quartering of the land thing also has an as above, so below relationship with quartering the sky. And so it's not uncommon to imagine the zodiac wheel in quarters, right? And then each quarter has 3 signs, right? Making up 12 signs. And so that's another sort of dynamic just going on there, is the quartering of the heavens and the quartering of earth, as it relates to the cross and in this system and everything. But this was a great conversation, man. Thanks for the invite, and you guys really, you guys brought it, and I learned some things, which I always very much appreciate.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to end on something that I kind of skipped over, but since you kind of brought it back up, I'll talk about it now. This idea of Rene Guenon talks about, he has a whole chapter on like where he talks about like the Holy War, and how war, whether it's the war in the heavens or war against, that man does, it's always because there's something that needs to be resolved. That there, a lot of times it there has to be like this chaotic factor before you get back to a central part of peace and harmony. Because after um afterwards, going back to the whole hero's journey aspect of it all, then the unknown and the known is the same thing. You always have that return, right? And so you need that chaos, that war element to create a new known unknown, or to get back to source, because there's something that there's an imbalance there. And I think, to me, when it comes to the Messiah myth, or any type of Messiah figure, whether it's Christ or any other legend out there, any kind of figure like that, it always has, they're always there because they're trying to bring some kind of peace. They're trying to remedy something. Again, going back to Avatar: The Last Airbender, the Avatar is born in a way that their personality is opposing to what the world is at the moment. So when Aang came back in his, in his current state in the show, he had his second coming. He was this young kid who didn't want to. He rejected the call at first. He didn't want to be the Avatar. He just wanted to be goofy, play games as a kid wants to do and everything. He didn't want to handle these adult responsibilities of avatarhood, his godhead, his Christhead. He just wanted to, just be a kid. And then over time he grows into, his rites of passage. But it's the reason why the world needed a kid to be the Avatar was because they was doing 100 years of war. So they needed a kid's perspective of having fun and everything, and kind of being kind of goofy, and kind of having this different perspective that wasn't hardened by war yet. And so the to me, I think that's a really good example of talking about the story of Jesus Christ, he's what the world needed, for that time. So whatever your purpose is, whoever's listening, whatever your purpose is in life, you can be a Christ figure in someone else's life and not know it, because you're the, if we're all talking about spiritual alchemy, whatever you have alchemically is what that other person needs to, cause a little bit of chaos and cause them to find their, return back to their sins, or something like that. So I just wanted to kind of toss that in there really quickly. Thank you, Mario. If you want to give all your where people can find you and what you're doing currently and everything.
Yeah, of course. Thanks again for having me. If people are interested in my work, the best way to find just where I'm at is by going to symbolicstudies.com. So you can find me on YouTube and Instagram and things like that. I am available for tarot readings if anyone's interested. And if you are kind of in particular interested in the zodiac, I cover a lot of that on my channels. And then also, if you're interested in the polar northern sort of weave, definitely check out my presentations. But yeah, this was a great time. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for coming back on. I always enjoy having you on. Branch, is there anything you want to end on?
I mean, I appreciated what you had to say there about the helping people with their cross, because in the story of the crucifixion, there was a man that ran to help Christ carry his cross to the hill of Calvary. And so that is a really important thing that you mentioned there. Some people's cross is heavy, right? So that alchemical, so rather than give your money to like a nonprofit or whatever, if you have that feeling that you need to help, actually do the work and go forge a relationship with somebody, give that money to them in secret and help them, listen to their problems and help them carry their cross, right? And so that's a really good lesson and message to send out this season. I appreciate that very much. And I'm on Telegram. You can find me as The Branch. I'm on X or Twitter, whatever they call it nowadays, as William Birkin. I LARP as an umbrella scientist on Instagram and Twitter to get the message out there. And we also have a Telegram chat for the King and Branch. When we do our episodes, we share them there, and anybody that we collaborate with, we share in there and pin those as well. So if you find us on there, you can find a lot of different videos.
Yeah, you both did a recent episode on the Threshold Saints, didn't you?
Oh yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Oh yeah,
both of you.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So yeah, go check out both Mario's episode and the Branches episode on the Threshold Saints. And it'll be out by the time I release this video, so I'll say I'm also going to be on the Threshold Saints.
Oh, awesome.
It's a fun thing to have in common.
And that's why I was talking so much about Avatar in this video, because it's in the frontal lobe of my mind, because our video on the video or the episode I'm doing on the Threshold Saints is going to be over the esoteric symbolism of Avatar: The Last Airbender. And we're going to be talking about the Messiah myth and all the symbolism in that. So you'll have 3 episodes of the Threshold Saints to check out, Mario, the Branches, and mine individually. And thanks again, Mario, and thanks for everyone for watching. And I hope everyone has an amazing spring. Start to the new year, because some calendars start in spring. And I hope everyone enjoyed this, and leave a like and comment in the bottom of this video and share it if you will. Thanks everyone. See you guys next time. And remember, amor fati.